Okay, this lesson for the Koine project class will focus on the controversies and energies that are directed toward the Ecclesia, that term in our Bible that we can see very specifically. So this is evaluation number 4 of Landmarkism, and we'll speak of literalism, the Ecclesia, and then center on what is it that has now been, I guess, assigned to Landmarkism, and see if we can distinguish from among it what does the Koine text say. So for the sake of time and efficiency, which my yesterday was completely consumed, but it was necessary. So let's just go to Galatians 2:20 for a moment. And Paul said of the Son, of the Son, to theoū, of the God. And this will help us with some of the features because Paul's about to speak of what Christ did for him personally and individually before he believed. Of the Son of the God to, well, notice we have 3 articles there. Of the one who ἀγαπήσαντός, genitive, of the one who loved, and he said, me, excuse me. And then we have the Granville Sharp, Kai, that is parabontos, genitive, of course, gave himself. This is alongside. ἁαυτόν, gave himself alongside ὑπὲρ on behalf of ἐμοῦ, of me. So Paul's speaking of what took place prior to the moment he believed. Now we can, as I call it, make it easy on ourselves, go back, return to our lesson, Revelation 1:5b, where John was speaking and he said to the one agape, just talk these out, santi, this is dative, and it's also an aorist, and the one who loved ἡμᾶς, Kai, this is the Granville Sharp again, that is lούσαντι, that is washed ἡμᾶς. Running out of room, so I'll try to be washed us apo away from tone the ἁμαρτιῶν. Now we just did this one, so it should be a lot more familiar for you. The sins, negative testimonies. You remember that? Negative testimonies. You remember to negate testimony with thought, word, and deed is against the law, is to negate the law. So when we negate testimony of Christ, as the religionist who said, we are of Moses, and he said, had you been of Moses, you would have believed me. That is, had you believed Moses, but you didn't, you would have believed me, but you won't, for he wrote of me. So they were negating Christ in the name of supplanting him, and that is using Moses to supplant Christ. And this is αίμον, away from the sins of us, our particular sins. And it says in the ἁμάτι, the blood of him. So in his own blood. So now John speaks of what took place after, and that is when they believed, they were washed, their sins were washed away. That is Christ now, the one who loved Paul, the individual, for example, and gave himself alongside on behalf of Paul, for example. Now John says he loved us, that is, washed us from our sins, away from our sins, our particular negative testimonies, by his own blood. So we now see Paul doesn't confuse himself with the ecclesias in Galatia. He actually, as the apostle, works with them and functions among them. John now speaks of what he and those churches in Revelation have in common. And then, of course, we have Ephesians 5:25b, I think. Yeah, B is the second part there. And it says, "Καθώς, just as ho Christos, just as the Christ, ἀγαπήσεν," that's just simple aorist indicative. Christ loved the ἐκκλησίαν. There we go. Love the Ecclesia. Now you can see that's from the word called, and that's from the word called out. This called out body, this assembly, congregation. Love the Ecclesia and kai parēdωkεν. And here it's the same, gave himself, as Paul said up here, gave himself alongside. And alongside gave ἑαυτὸν, himself. There we go. ὑπὲρ, on behalf of aŭτῆς, her. There we go. So at this moment, we don't see Paul speaking of Christ doing, so he speaks of what Christ did for him that persuaded him, as he said in Galatians 2:16, when he noticed that no kind of man is being justified out from any kind of works of any kind of law, except through faithfulness of Jesus Christ. Even this here, this part of Galatians 2:20 speaks back to the faithfulness of Christ to have done this, to have given himself on his behalf. Now John here, we have this text showing the same love, but this love here is the act to wash those who believed. So as soon as they believed, Paul said what he did for him. So what Christ did persuaded Paul to believe, and then what Christ did is now, when we believe, washes away our sins. And now Ephesians 5:25b, just as Christ loved the Ecclesia, that is, and gave himself alongside on behalf of her. Again, this doesn't require, I think some of the confusion and controversy comes, well, do we then have to include every single person that Christ died for in order for the Ecclesia to be there in Ephesus? And of course not. And I say of course not, because we have 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. I'll just put that, and 2 Corinthians. And in the introductions to these letters, Paul wrote to the Ecclesia. And just Yoda subscript shows the locative to the Ecclesia. Oh my goodness. Ecclesia to theoū of the God. Then he went on and said specifically to the one, I'll put in parentheses, to the one oβέβσαι, the one being. So to the Ecclesia of the God, to the one being in Korintho, locative case, in Corinth. And there, again, it's unnecessary tension, confusion, controversy, whatever it is. But Paul didn't confuse himself with the Ecclesia. He didn't distinguish, he didn't limit or say that what Christ, so Christ gave himself on behalf of every individual and every individual church. Some have diminished the Ecclesia in a particular place as not actually being the Ecclesia in that, being in that place. And that would just be somehow a willingness to ignore or a bias from priming that says not to recognize the Ecclesia, 100% the Ecclesia of the God as one being in a particular place. But the Bible makes that really clear. Paul told Timothy that if he tarries, he said, I wrote this in order that, I have to hurry because pastoring, I need to check on someone in the hospital. Yesterday, it was something. In order that this is a perfect active subjunctive, in order that you might have noticed, and then of course continue to notice how necessary it is, in oίκῳ, in house theoū of God, so in God's house, in house of God. Then he used this word here, ana streph esthai. That's a present passive infinitive. How necessary it is in God's house to be being turned upwardly. You remember he told the church at Corinth that they were becoming worse for assembling. They had gone in and with their social interest to be served at the Lord's table, they were distinguishing themselves one for another according to their social status and custom of dining and having meals. And he said, to be being turned upwardly in God's house. Let me see. Ἑαυτοῖς, which estin, which is an ecclesia, theoū zōντος, ecclesia of living God. And yes, you could say of a living God, to put the emphasis on the quality and reality of God and his being alive, and this being his house made of living stones, built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices, Ephesians, fitly framed together, we have all of these texts here. And also in Corinth, he said to them, he said, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. So I'm not sure, but it seems very plain, self-evident in the Koine text as we word it out, that Paul did not consider himself an ecclesia of living God, of especially a living God, the only living God. And he certainly was admonishing Timothy in strongest language, saying how necessary it is to be being turned upwardly. That would be, and it's referring to behavior, as we noticed in our Bible, behavior, how to behave yourself, and it's obligation, a necessary obligation, and it is being turned upwardly. Now that agency, you remember Revelation 2:1 says Jesus in his circumscribed behavior is conducting in the churches, in the ecclesias. He told his disciples before he left, those he had already called out, and among whom were still those that John had pointed and said, notice the Lamb from God, and they had left John, you remember that, and they had accompanied with Christ, and then they began, so from John's baptism, they began church baptism, and he was telling them that it's expedient that I go away so that the Comforter will come, so that 100%, which is a conclusion, the ecclesia fully and 100% is being in Corinth. The in ecclesia, in God's house, so the ecclesia is now called God's house, not the dead stone, brick and mortar that would be coming down soon. So now the ecclesia is God's house living. Each ecclesia is God's house, an ecclesia of a living God, not the pagan temples and things like that, like Temple Diana. So this is a good lesson. It's just, I don't know. I've never really come across someone, except sometimes pastors banter and people want to take issue if that ecclesia or if that quote church down the road in that particular place, for example, Landmark, where I pastor, is that an ecclesia of God? Yes. And is it 100% fully there? Well, yes. Now, the only diminutive thing I've ever heard was a snarky remark by a youngster, I guess a novice or something. He called, for example, Landmark, he would say of us a lowercase C church. But now that would not be anything Paul would say. Now, Paul's the scholastic, and his letters are with us today, and we still have Paul. He would not speak, and nor would he even find it appropriate. It would not be the result of someone who had been turned upwardly with a reverence and awe of God and a living God, especially the one true living God. And it certainly wouldn't represent a behavior that was of necessity in an ecclesia. So you have a blessed day, but I really can't find the problem. Paul said he died for him, which certainly doesn't mean he only died for him. And I think that's one of the things that happened here. I've come across people who believe you have to include every single person on whose behalf Christ died for this ecclesia, but he was actually writing to the ecclesia in Ephesus, which means the ecclesia was fully there, and he did not by any stretch of the imagination, by saying Christ gave himself on behalf of the ecclesia, mean that he did not give himself on behalf of anyone else who had believed. He was speaking specifically. So what's been demarcated by Paul is himself as an individual. What's been demarcated by John the Apostle, the Revelator, the one who wrote Revelation, is speaking of himself and those churches after they had believed what Christ did for them. And then what Paul is saying to the church in Ephesus is what Christ did for them, that they rejoice in both past and now presently, being told that this is what we were purchased by this precious blood. And then he tells the church in Corinth, which of all churches, to know all that was taking place there with all those people who had come in as adult if you will, came in from all that background and baggage, and still he made the declaration they were the Ecclesia of the God to the ones being in Corinth. So you have a blessed day. Enjoy this lesson.